Okay, well, I got kind of interrupted there. So let's pick up where we left off. So yes, this is going to have two bits to it. Where was I? I don't know. There we go. So we go from immigrants moving into big cities. They tend to congregate in neighborhoods where of people that speak their own language and know their own customs. To kind of help ease assimilation, really. So you're going to have, this is why you have Little Italy, this is why you have Chinatown, and why this exists in multiple cities around the country. And, you're going to have newspapers and that kind of thing that are published in native languages. You're going to have, churches that are familiar to their country of origin and that kind of thing. And so you're going to see that helps facilitate that. Even within large cities like Chicago, you'll have several blocks that are mostly Swedish people, and then several blocks that are mostly Polish people. And this is going to ease that acculturation. And of course, job skills and marketability are going to affect that. Education is going to affect that. If you have a job skill that's in high demand, you're going to make good wages, and people are going to be more willing to work with you. If you have no real serious job skill, you're going to find life pretty tough. And so it's just going to vary. Having money to have a decent place to live, or do you have to rely on friends and family? All of those things shape the immigrant experience. And there's all kinds of videos and stories. Far and Away is an obvious one, but there's lots of other ones. Jacob Riis, we're going to be reading him in class. He's the father of photojournalism. He documented urban life for immigrants in his book, How the Other Half Lives. And it's this book that largely brings the message to the middle class about how the working poor are living and how they're struggling. So we see that happening there. And notice this picture right here, how many people we have sleeping. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We got 7 people in this one little tiny room. So yeah, it was pretty shocking for most individuals. Some more of his photographs. We talked about this one already. These pictures of kids, some of these are staged actually. Speaking of photojournalism and realism and that kind of thing, Jacob Riis he would take pictures of kids, because one of the side effects of this kind of tenement housing in these working class neighborhoods is that you have kids that are unsupervised. We don't have a public school system in place in many of these cities, right? Public school or education is something that the middle class provide their kids. The working class don't have that option, right? They can't afford the tuition, or they can't afford the books, or they need their kids to actually work. So these kids end up roaming the streets unsupervised. And so a lot of what Riis does is take pictures of these kids trying to kind of pull at the heartstrings of the middle class. And it's these kinds of photographs, this kind of what Teddy Roosevelt will call muck-raking journalism, that will draw the middle class into paying attention to the plight of all of this. This map shows you kind of where some of the people settled. You can see San Francisco, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. You can see kind of the impact of immigration on those particular cities. You also have immigration from Asia coming in through San Francisco. And of course, Chinese immigration began in the mid-1800s. We've already talked about this with the railroads and the mines and such. There's a lot of discrimination against the Chinese, mostly because they look very different. European immigration, they're going to look very similar to what native-born Americans look like, unless, of course, you're talking a really swarthy, olive-colored kind of Italian guy. But by and large, they're going to look a lot like native-born Americans. So if they lose their accent, or they change their name so it's Americanized, then you're not going to have a clear, obvious difference. But for the Chinese, it's very different. They're not going to be able to change the way their face looks or the way their eyes look. And then you throw into that some cultural things like the ponytail, which has had great significance for the Chinese back in the 1800s. And so they're going to be resistant to cutting that off, especially if they're pretty new immigrants. So everyone's going to be able to identify them. And so there's a lot of discrimination against the Chinese, which is why in San Francisco you have a very vibrant Chinese community, because they had to be very self-sufficient. And of course, notice the push factors. China was extremely overcrowded, lots of poverty and unemployment. China had been really kind of taken advantage of by European powers, used as a field where they basically took advantage of the resources of China. Now, China set itself up for this in a lot of ways by kind of taking the attitude back in the 1600s that, well, we have all the good stuff. If they really want it, they'll come to us. And in fact, China was exploring before Europe was, as far as exploring India and that kind of thing. And they stopped that because they said, why are we wasting money and time on this? Let's focus on ourselves. So they do this, and the Europeans start showing up, and that's all well and good. Until, of course, they create an imbalance in trade. And then the Europeans figure out that the Chinese like opium. And so they start importing opium from Turkey and northern India and create a huge, massive opium problem in China. And so this kind of begins, you throw into this the nature of the Chinese dynasties and how they would cycle through, and the bureaucracy and the disconnect of the imperial court from the ordinary people. A lot of this creates circumstances that make China not a very fun place to be in the 1800s. And in fact, this kind of sets up for the rise of the Chinese communists, and why Taiwan has a tense relationship with China. All of this goes back really to the 1800s. So Chinese immigration was coming into the U.S., and we kind of had this connection there. And then we'll get upset about Chinese immigration, and we'll throw up a barrier to it and kind of cut China off. And so we won't really be interested in China again until Hitler's rising to power and Japan's rising to power. And then all of a sudden we'll start paying attention to China, and we'll be like, oh, we're going to help the Chinese. Except by then we've completely lost contact with what's going on in China. We don't understand them. We don't recognize that the nationalist Chinese are corrupt, and it's the communist Chinese that are affecting any kind of solid resistance to the Japanese. And so there's kind of this long kind of understory to our relationship to China that really begins right here. And so there's going to be a lot of frustration because the Chinese immigrants were known for being, they would take any job, and they worked really hard, and they worked for cheap. And they didn't unionize like the native-born Americans did, and they didn't do any of that kind of stuff. And so they were actually in pretty high demand. But that's why you're going to see unions coming out really harshly against immigration, because they don't want that kind of labor competition. The Japanese immigration story is a little bit different. That doesn't really pick up until the early 1900s. Japan had been very isolationist until you get to like the 1850s. And then Commodore Matthew Perry, not the guy from Friends, shows up, and he, shows them how great our technology is. And Japan realizes they've kind of missed something. And so they get very kind of paranoid, and they start focusing on creating, industrializing, and doing it very rapidly. And so they do have some immigration to the United States, but they very tightly control it. This is kind of the message of the Japanese society, especially going into World War II. But even now today, it's a very tightly controlled society where, it's the collective response that's the most important. And so they and because there's concerns about immigration, when Teddy Roosevelt's president, he reaches what we call the gentleman's agreement, where Japan agrees to kind of limit immigration from their end if America won't limit immigration from our end. So Japanese immigration happens, and certainly when we get to World War II and we talk about the Japanese internment camps, there were enough Japanese there that we do have a minority of Japanese on the West Coast. But it was never to the numbers that the Chinese were. And this is kind of intentional on the part of Japan and on the part of the United States. Angel Island is the place that gets developed for that. You can see here's the Pacific Ocean, San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz. Here's Angel Island right there. This is created in the early 1900s as a way of kind of facilitating that kind of gate into the United States. Same kind of process, physical, medical exams, making sure they're healthy and all that kind of stuff, checking them for disease and lice and quarantines and all that kind of thing. Nativism is a reaction to immigration. It's a preference for native-born people and a desire to limit immigration. We talked about this last semester when we talked about the Know Nothing Party and their frustration with Irish immigration. By the time you get to the 1870s, we're not so worried about Irish immigration anymore. Not that the Irish weren't discriminated against, because they were in certain places. So that discrimination still existed, but we start being very concerned about other immigration as well. And of course, this is even more telling as immigration demographics shift from that Western Europe to that Eastern Europe. And so that you begin to have these fears of what immigration is going to do to us. What is, the non-Protestant influence? Catholic, Jewish, Eastern Orthodox. These each have religious leaders that basically command a degree of loyalty. The Catholic Church has the Pope. The Eastern Orthodox Church has the Patriarch. The Jewish Church has rabbis. And so the idea is that these people would challenge the concept of American democracy. And this is a pretty valid concern. We'll see that, whether it's Alfred Smith or whether it's JFK, this question about what a Catholic's obligation is to the church is a pretty powerful one. So don't think for a minute this whole, Obama's a Muslim thing, that this questioning of religion and how it might influence somebody. Now, Obama's not a Muslim. I'm not saying that. But people have said that he is, and that's why he makes some of the decisions that he does. Well, that concept is not necessarily new, because people ask that of JFK. When Alfred Smith runs as the first Catholic presidential candidate, they ask that question of him. But there's a lot of fears about these organized religions that are not Protestant. Labor unions feel that immigration undermines them, and there's often a lot of ethnic violence where one group doesn't like the other. This is true between the immigrant groups, the Irish versus the Italians, or the Poles versus the Germans. It's also true if you're talking about native-born Americans against certain groups. And a lot of this has to do with economic pressure. How many jobs are available? What is the unemployment rate? Do people have enough housing? Those kinds of things create pressures on societies that cause these kind of subgroups to react against each other. So just kind of keep all of that in the back of your mind as a reason for why nativism happens. This shows you the second wave of immigration. You can see no Chinese immigration. There is some Japanese immigration. We still have some from Western Europe, but even more from Eastern Europe and from Turkey. So that's going to be a huge change. Notice also Mexican immigration due to the Mexican Civil War in the early 20th century. And so that will kind of begin to affect things. And notice the impact of World War I on immigration as well. Reasons for nativist opposition: fear of Catholicism or other religions, unions feeling like it's being weakened, just the general fear that they're going to take jobs away from Americans. And how are we going to be American? We're trying to resolve what it is to have an American culture. If you look at this particular cartoon, the inevitable result to the American working man of indiscriminate immigration. And you can see here his hat says pauper labor. And we see over here it says Ellis Island. So if we analyze this cartoon, we see that the pauper, who is very Eastern European looking, very kind of swarthy, Italian, Greek, kind of Turkish looking, is reaching around the American working man to take his bread and butter, which is a pseudonym for, or not a pseudonym, but is a substitution for his job. So he's losing his job. He's losing his ability to care for his family to the pauper labor, because we have indiscriminate immigration. We're not asking questions of who's coming into this country. Are they educated? Do they have resources? Do they have someplace to go? We just have this open door policy that lets anybody come in, and they're going to take away our jobs. And so this cartoon is very powerful to tell us about the nativist reaction, and it's very clearly asking for immigration restrictions. This one, if you'll notice here, look very closely at that right there. What is that? People will initially say it's an alligator, and that is the implication, but if you notice, it looks like a bishop's hat, right? Oops, come back here. It looks like a bishop's hat. We have essentially, right, the cross on the background. I believe this is the Vatican, right? So we've got Catholicism coming onto our shores to attack our families, that we have to be very careful about the impact of such influences on our society. Notice we have like I don't know if it's a guillotine or if it's like a place where they hang people, but this concept that Catholicism is going to bring punishment. So there's a lot of fears that go into immigration. And if you pay any attention to immigration arguments now, you'll know that that's still the case. Some of the specific nativist responses, the Working Man's Party in 1870 opposed Asian immigration. The American Protective Association opposed Catholic immigration. 1882 is the big year. That's the banner year for immigration reform. We pass a law that says that you can't be a convict, you couldn't have been mentally ill, and you have to have money. And to enforce that you have to have money, they place a 50-cent tax on each immigrant. So you have to not only have money for transportation, you not only have to say, I have so much money in my pocket, but then you have to have enough money to pay the tax as well. So this is one way to kind of restrict that immigration. For those of you that have paid attention during the Larson discussion, when it talks about the LPC, likely to become a public charge, that's kind of this concept. The Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882 stopped Chinese immigration for 10 years and prevented Chinese immigrants from becoming citizens. I would suggest that that's in direct violation to the Constitution. It never goes to the Supreme Court, really. Chinese protest, and they do try to, stand up to the law, but nobody really pays any attention. 1902, the law is made permanent, and it is not repealed until 1943. And you can see right here the decline in the numbers of Chinese. So this is kind of an interesting side note to why we have this kind of disconnect with the Chinese in the United States. And I think it's just kind of interesting. Other urban problems that we see, notice the dead horse. Isn't that lovely? And notice the children playing next to the dead horse with their feet in what is actually a sewer. So yeah, that looks like a great place to raise kids, doesn't it? This is what I mean by a lack of city services, okay? Nobody to clean up the dead horse. Nobody to keep the kids from playing in the sewer system. So this is your classic picture of urban problems right there. Many city charters have a decentralized government where you've got really kind of this council system where each guy represents his neighborhood, and you don't have a strong central authority. Well, what that means is you don't have a city that can respond to the needs of its community. And so you'll have, especially the quicker the cities grow, the worse this problem is. The political machines evolve to kind of make the city responsive, but how they work this is you have like a neighborhood. Let's say it's an Irish neighborhood, and they have an alderman that reports to the city councilor, to the head city guy, to the mayor. And that alderman gets special favors from the mayor, where he gets access to contracts and building jobs and all that kind of stuff. And he uses that influence to put the immigrants in his neighborhood to work, okay? So the immigrants in his neighborhood owe their jobs, owe their livelihood, owe their security to him. They have a dead horse in the street, they call up the alderman or the alderman's man, and they say, hey, there's a dead horse next to my building. Can you see if somebody can come get it? And the alderman says, sure, I'll come remove that dead horse. And he does. Well, so you owe him for that, you owe him for your job, you owe him for the place that you live because he probably is the landlord or represents the landlord. And all of that's great, okay? What does the alderman get in exchange? He gets votes. Now, certainly if you're a fresh off the boat immigrant, you're probably not going to be voting right away. But remember, the Americanization process was much simpler back then. So you're going to be voting pretty soon. So once you are a voter, and this is even particularly true if if you move from like the rural areas into the cities, you get into these systems where you essentially exchange your vote for city services. The alderman says, okay, I'll take care of you, but when it comes time for the city election, these are the people you're going to vote for. And we don't have a secret ballot. So if you don't vote for those people, everybody's going to know it, right? And you don't want to upset the alderman because then you're going to lose your job. Or you're going to lose your place to live. Or the next time you have a dead horse, you're out of luck. Or if your husband gets injured, they're going to kick you out of your house. There's all these kind of connections that happen. The movie Far and Away, the movie Gangs of New York, both do a really good job of depicting this system. And so this is kind of how this works, right? It's this, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And there's a chain of command that goes from, the representatives of the alderman to the alderman who goes to the guy above him, which is usually the mayor. The mayor reports to the state representatives. They report to the state senators. The state senators report to the party chairman. And the party chairman reports to his big chairman, who's the guy that essentially controls politics from the national level to the state level to the local level. So we really have a political system, especially true in the cities. but even to a lesser degree at the national level. We have a political system that's not responsive to the voters, but rather responsive to a handful of individuals that control everything. Think Koch brothers, however you say their names. Koch, I think it's Koch brothers. And so we have that essentially creating the system. Now, there's pros and cons to this, right? The pro is these systems, these political machines, are going to ease assimilation, and they're going to keep people from going hungry, and they're going to provide these services that we come to expect when oh, you need some food. Okay, well, we'll give you an allowance of food until you find a job. Oh, you need a job. Let me train you for this job. Oh, you need a place to live. Let me hook you up with that. Like I said, if your husband gets injured, you don't have to worry about being kicked out of your home because the alderman's going to take care of you because you vote. And, you have a child that's about to be voting age, and so they're going to get to vote. And so they're going to do that to take care of the community. So you've got this system that has, in a way, a balance to it. But the problem is that's only going to represent the small immigrant neighborhoods that live close to the factories. That's not going to help the middle-class neighborhoods. Matter of fact, the middle-class neighborhoods will be underrepresented. And remember, these are the ones with the education, with the nicer standard of living, and they're not going to like the power that these local immigrant neighborhoods, these working-class neighborhoods, have against them. And so you're going to see, this is the great irony of progressive reform and election reform, where we take that system of political machines and we tear that down because that's not democratic. But ironically, in tearing down that system, we leave the immigrant, the poor, without any kind of real representation, without them being motivated to go out and vote, because why should they? It doesn't do them any good to go vote. So it's kind of one of the ironies of this whole system. So just kind of be aware of that. Graft, corruption, overspending, breaking the budget. Tammany Hall and Boss Tweed were most famous for this. Boss Tweed would charge like double for a construction project because he would actually pay people and then he would pocket the same amount himself. So this kind of graft is a huge issue. And the political corruption spreads from the local level all the way to the national level. And if you don't believe that, look at the whiskey ring or the Teapot Dome scandal or any of the other scandals that happen in connection to the Gilded Age. So just kind of understand this process of political machines and how that works. These cartoons show you right here. That's what's the matter. Boss Tweed, as long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it? He controls the ballot. He's the one that controls how it's counted because he can control the voters. This one right here, the Kelly machine. This is another, party boss. New York City democracy. This machine is run on democratic temperance principles. This idea of temperance, of trying to restrict alcohol consumption. But notice he's sitting on a keg of bourbon, and he's got the hat that says boss. Notice the public are cordially invited to inspect the machine but ask no questions. And he's basically running everything from his little perch. Life in the city, the middle class. The industrialization creates a middle class because the wealthy have to pay somebody to run their businesses and manage their affairs. These are the largest consumers of the new products that are being created. They center on home and family. This is where child development and education and all these kinds of things that we focus on now are middle class assumptions, not working class assumptions, at least from the Gilded Age. And they become very concerned with social problems. They look at sobriety and morality as the way to solve social problems. Women largely work in the home, but typically most middle-class families can afford a degree of outside help. So you have a large section of the working-class population that's working in domestic service, and they're benefiting the middle class. Well, what this does is it frees the middle-class woman to then be engaged in, social work. To work with her church, to work with her, ladies group, to make conditions better. And you're also going to see the middle class demands new forms of leisure. Most of your major sports develop from this time period. Shopping as an excursion develops from this time period. Boxing, baseball, all that kind of stuff. This picture right here shows the classically stereotypical middle class family. It's an advertisement for Smith Brothers Chemically Pure Borax, which is a type of soap, right? Notice first off, we have the black woman, largely as a caricature, be making fun of her, kind of the Aunt Jemima look, right? She's doing the physical labor. She's really working hard. Notice the way the clothes she wears. that it's brightly colored and all that kind of stuff. Then if you look over here, we've got this lady. She's clearly engaged in work, not quite the same heavy labor that this woman is. She's got red hair. To me, that implies an Irish immigrant. Very pale skin. She's clearly got kind of, muted, basically work clothes on. And I can't quite tell what she's doing. Throwing something on the ground, maybe, I don't know. So she's working alongside. The ones I want to draw your attention to are right here in the middle. Notice this is going to be your classic middle-class lady of the house. She's supervising. She's looking at the cloth saying, oh, this is not quite clean enough. Let's use the borax and really get this stain out. And she's supervising the process. To me, this could be another immigrant laborer, but I'm more likely to think this is a daughter, perhaps, that she's training. Note that she's got the nice apron, the nicer set of clothes than either of the other two ladies. And so to me, this kind of implies that she's teaching her daughter how to keep a house. Notice the similarity in the red clothing that would denote wealth. So I think this is kind of an interesting advertisement to kind of depict what Gilded Age middle-class life was like. All right, I'm going to stop here because the bell's about to ring and I'll have to finish recording this later. Alrighty.